Welcome. In this series, we embark on a unique journey into the mind and memories of one of the most important and controversial figures who shaped 20th century history, the legendary foreign minister and premier of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov. Titled Inside the Kremlin, Molotov Remembers, this series is no ordinary historical narrative. It is a collection of confessions and ideological defenses regarding what transpired at the pinnacle of the Soviet state behind a shocking veil of secrecy poured directly from the mouth of the ultimate witness who made those very decisions. The poet and writer Felix Chuev created this unique archive by conducting 140 in-depth interviews with Molotov over a span of exactly 17 years, from 1969 until Molotov's death in 1986. Molotov refused to pen his own memoirs, declaring, "I do not write memoirs, I write about socialism," and thus left behind no classical autobiography. This series presents you with a distilled, thematic, and striking summary of those 140 historic conversations, delivered in the style of a captivating podcast narrative. So who was this Molotov? Born in 1890, Vyacheslav Molotov joined the Bolshevik Party in 1906 at the mere age of 16. With an uninterrupted party membership spanning 80 years throughout his life, he set a record in Soviet history that is hard to break. He was one of the key members of the Military Revolutionary Committee, working shoulder to shoulder with Lenin to prepare the October Revolution. During the Stalin era, he served as the undisputed second-in-command of the state, acting as the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Premier, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. He personally signed the decrees and exile orders that determined the fate of millions, as well as the grand and ruthless diplomatic maneuvers of the Second World War. Even after all this bloody and staggering history, he felt not the slightest remorse for the Great Terror purges of the 1930s or the ruthless actions taken during collectivization. He continued to defend everything in the name of the survival of the state and socialism. In this massive series, we will examine the history and the memories across 4 main acts. In the first act, we will focus on Molotov's emergence onto the world stage as foreign minister and the behind-the-scenes of the Second World War. We will hear, in his own words, the ruthless pragmatism behind the 1939 German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact that shocked the world, and the historically tense negotiations he personally conducted with Hitler in Berlin. We will also witness up close the grueling Cold War diplomatic battles he waged, like playing chess, with Western leaders such as Churchill, Roosevelt, and Truman at Yalta and Potsdam. In the second act, we rewind time back to those stormy days of the 1917 revolution. We will look at Molotov's close collaboration with Lenin, Lenin's little-known, uncompromising and harsh side, and the Bolsheviks' process of seizing power. In this chapter, we will also explore the factional wars within the party, Lenin's relentless ideological struggles against other revolutionary giants like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, and how Stalin was seated in the general secretary chair through a tactic designed by Lenin himself. The third act will undoubtedly be the darkest and most harrowing part of the series. We will discuss how Stalin seized absolute power and the horrors of the collectivization war, where millions of peasants were exiled from their homes and starved to death. Molotov will recount with chilling composure his psychological state while personally signing the execution orders of tens of thousands of people during the Great Terror years of 1937-1938, and how he viewed this as an absolute necessity to eliminate a potential fifth column ahead of the impending war. Furthermore, we will delve into Stalin's increasingly pathological paranoia in his final years, how even Molotov's own wife, Polina, was imprisoned by Stalin's order, and Stalin's still debated mysterious death, complete with Molotov's own suspicions. In the final act, we will focus on the savage power struggles that erupted in the corridors of the Kremlin following Stalin's death. We will listen to how Beria was dramatically trapped and executed by firing squad, followed by the fatal ideological clash Molotov experienced with Khrushchev. We will witness how Molotov, who viewed Khrushchev's famous de-Stalinization move at the 20th Congress as a betrayal of Marxism-Leninism and a slide into petty bourgeois consumer socialism, was expelled from the party in 1957. Finally, in the twilight of his life, we will hear his harsh criticisms directed at the Brezhnev and Gorbachev eras as a solitary but unshakably stubborn figure, and we will close the series with his quiet funeral in 1986. Get ready for this staggering adventure of one of history's most feared figures, a man who, even as he drew his last breath at the age of 96, did not compromise an ounce of his ideals or the decrees he signed. Now, we are setting off to unlock the doors of this colossal narrative. Molotov states that as foreign minister, his primary duty was to expand the borders of the Soviet homeland to their maximum limits, and he argues that together with Stalin, they successfully accomplished this task. The moment after the Second World War when Stalin hung a small map on the wall to inspect the new Soviet borders stands as the most tangible example of this sense of achievement. Looking at the map, Stalin expressed deep satisfaction with pushing the Finnish border further away from Leningrad, reclaiming the Baltic states, which he described as century-old Russian lands, and uniting all Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Moldovans under one roof. Stalin also viewed the acquisition of the Kuril Islands, Sakhalin, Port Arthur, and Dairen in the east, passed to the Soviets through China, as a massive victory. His only dissatisfaction lay with the borderline south of the Caucasus. The foundation of this vast border expansion strategy rested on the agreements reached with German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop in 1939. The process of annexing the Baltic states, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and Bessarabia into the Soviet Union was executed with incredibly harsh and uncompromising policies under the brutal conditions of the era. Molotov does not hide the heavy pressure they exerted on bourgeois governments, openly confessing that when the Latvian foreign minister and the Estonian war minister came to Moscow, he told them flatly, "You will not return home without signing the agreement to join us." He justifies this coercion by stating that these states had no other choice, caught as they were between fascist Germany and Soviet Russia, and that the Soviets absolutely needed these territories for their own security. Explaining that this method used in the Baltic countries did not work in Poland, Molotov emphasizes that the Poles maintained a highly uncompromising stance, and that alliance talks with the West led nowhere. When the West refused to allow Soviet troops to enter Czechoslovakia and Poland, the Soviet Union was forced to make a deal with Germany to secure its own safety. The fundamental goal of Soviet diplomacy here was to keep the German armies away from its borders, and to secure Polish territories that it believed unquestionably belonged to the USSR. Following the partition of Poland, when the Finnish question came to the fore, the Soviets demanded only a small territory around Vyborg solely to protect Leningrad, but the Finns proved to be highly stubborn. Molotov claims that not annexing the whole of Finland was a sign of great mercy and a highly clever move. He argues that if this country, with its fiercely stubborn population, had been completely annexed, it would have become an infected wound for the Soviets and a constant pretext for anti-Soviet actions. During the redrawing of borders, the annexation of the Bessarabia and Bukovina regions witnessed fascinating diplomatic standoffs and even some geographical blunders. While demanding Bessarabia from Romania, the Soviets gave the Romanian ambassador a strict deadline to withdraw his troops, during which Hitler advised Romania to submit. The most striking part of the story is Molotov's open confession that, at the time, he did not know the border geography between Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary very well. When he demanded the Chernivtsi, Bukovina region under the pretext of uniting Ukrainians, the German ambassador Count von der Schulenburg objected, stating that this region had never belonged to Russia. Despite Schulenburg reminding him that it had always been Austrian and Romanian territory, Molotov remained obstinate. In the end, Hitler was forced to accept this demand as well, unexpectedly approving the transfer of Chernivtsi to the Soviets. The most bizarre moments of this forced and pragmatic relationship with the Germans occurred during Ribbentrop's arrival in Moscow in 1939. In fact, as Ribbentrop's plane approached Moscow, it was nearly shot down by Soviet soldiers because they couldn't identify whose aircraft it was, escaping disaster at the very last moment. As champagne flowed during the meetings in the Kremlin, Stalin jokingly raised his glass to the new anti-Cominternist Stalin, a jest that filled Ribbentrop with immense joy. Ribbentrop enthusiastically reported this to Hitler, who praised his minister's diplomatic success. Molotov recounts this ironically as proof that Hitler could never comprehend Marxists. He also mockingly notes how, during the Kremlin dinner, the foreign minister of fascist Germany was forced to raise a toast to Lazar Kaganovich, who was Jewish. Behind all these historic partitions and border changes lies the claim, frequently raised by Western historians, that there was a secret additional protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. However, Molotov fiercely and angrily denies that any secret agreement was made in a process he was directly involved in. Rejecting Western theories that Stalin and he sacrificed the Baltic states to appease Hitler, he notes they knew very well that such a step would only whet Hitler's appetite further. He maintains that the real truth was simply the Soviets' need for these areas for their own security, and that a secret pact was absolute fiction and nonsense. Asserting that the entire process was conducted cleanly, Molotov believes these allegations were deliberately spread to tarnish the Soviet Union's reputation. Similarly, he fiercely rejects and dismisses as total fabrication and American radio nonsense all rumors claiming that there was secret correspondence or peace offers between Stalin and Hitler during the war. or that he secretly met with Ribbentrop in Mogilov in the midst of the conflict. Molotov's visit to Berlin in November 1940 and his historic meetings with Hitler constitute one of the most critical moments where Soviet diplomacy directly confronted fascism. Although Hitler is frequently portrayed in Western media and films as a screaming madman or a lunatic, Molotov states that he did not see him that way. Instead, he found himself facing a man of medium height who was exceptionally vain and arrogant. According to Molotov, Hitler was an intelligent man, yet narrow-minded due to his extreme nationalism and blind anti-communism. He possessed an egotism trapped within his own primitive ideas. Throughout these grueling meetings in Berlin, Hitler tried to act with utmost respect and restraint toward Molotov. Due to diplomatic protocol during the negotiations, they had to speak like civilized human beings without cursing or shouting. Another fascinating detail emerged during dinner. Declaring that his people were not drinking coffee due to the war, Hitler had banned coffee for himself as well. Furthermore, he ate no meat, followed a strictly vegetarian diet, and neither drank nor smoked. Molotov remarks that he felt as though he were sitting next to a rabbit munching on grass, noting that Hitler projected the profile of a total idealist. Naturally, Molotov himself adhered to none of these restrictions, and the other Nazis at the table continued to eat and drink heavily. On the first day of the meetings, inside his massive office with soaring ceilings, Hitler did most of the talking. He spoke passionately, describing Britain as a pathetic island on the verge of being crushed, and arguing that its possession of half the world was a grave injustice. He proposed to Molotov that the Soviet Union turn its gaze southward, toward the warm waters through Iran and India. By floating the idea of dividing the world, he attempted to draw the Soviets to his side. However, Molotov immediately saw through the sinister plot behind these grand and flowery promises. Hitler's true objective was to drag the Soviets into an adventurous quagmire in the south and force them into a war with Britain, leaving them completely dependent on Germany. On the second day of the talks, Molotov set aside Hitler's tales of global vision and abruptly brought the conversation to the Soviets' immediate security concerns and border issues. Reminding him of the 1939 pact, he asked sternly and stubbornly why Germany was maintaining troops in Finland and Romania, pointing out that this directly violated their agreement. Hitler was visibly uncomfortable with these border issues and tried to brush them aside, calling them minor details. He wanted to steer the conversation back to grand matters like the partition of the world. Yet, Molotov cornered Hitler completely by asking how they could possibly discuss grand matters when they couldn't even coordinate their actions on secondary issues. Bewildered by Molotov's demand for clear and definitive answers, Hitler was at a loss for words. Through this obstinate stance, Molotov realized that the Germans actually had no intention of keeping their previous promises. All those offers to move south were nothing more than a flimsy trap designed to lure the Soviets into an adventure. During the photo sessions, Hitler put his arm around Molotov's shoulder, and Molotov posed with a smile. Years later, when asked in Canada why he was smiling in that photograph, Molotov replied, "They hadn't managed to extract anything from us, and they never would." Hitler merely wanted to draw him to his side, but he was left deeply frustrated. During his time in Berlin, Molotov interacted not only with Hitler but also with other high-ranking Nazis. He met with figures like Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, and Rudolf Hess, gaining an opportunity to observe their offices. While Göring's office was filled with massive paintings and rugs, Hess's office was extremely modest, resembling a hospital room. Contemning the Nazi Party's organizational structure, Molotov subtly mocked Hess by asking if they had a party program or a constitution. When Hess confessed that they possessed neither, Molotov sarcastically remarked on what a high level of organization they had. At the end of the meetings, Hitler accompanied Molotov all the way to the cloakroom to help him put on his coat. There, Hitler remarked that he was certain history would remember Stalin's name forever. When Molotov replied that he had no doubt about it, Hitler then expressed his hope that history would remember him as well. With the same composure, Molotov added that he had no doubt about that either. This brief dialogue gave Molotov the impression that Hitler was not only afraid of Soviet power, but also held a profound awe for Stalin's personality. Upon his return to Moscow, Stalin jokingly asked Molotov, "How did he tolerate you when you were telling him all those things?" Molotov gave a short and precise answer: "He just had to endure it." Following these diplomatic maneuvers, Molotov completed his mission by replacing their ambassadors in Berlin, whom he deemed inadequate. Regarding the outbreak of the Second World War, one of the greatest myths propagated in the West, and later within the Soviet Union itself, is the claim that Stalin caught the country unprepared for war because he blindly trusted Hitler. Molotov categorically rejects this claim, pointing out that it was out of the question for Stalin, a man who didn't even fully trust his own closest associates, to actually believe Hitler. The Soviet leadership knew perfectly well that war was inevitable, but because they were aware that the army was not yet equipped to handle Germany, they sought to delay the conflict at all costs. This policy of postponement required giving Hitler absolutely no provocation or pretext to attack, and thanks to this stalling tactic, the Soviet Union bought itself exactly 1 year and 10 months of crucial time. Molotov also offers a very clear explanation regarding the criticism that countless intelligence reports from border agents or defectors about the exact start date of the war were ignored. According to him, acting on those intelligence reports to put the entire military on full war alert and massing troops at the border would have meant handing Hitler the exact pretext he was searching for on a silver platter. To prevent the Germans from attacking under the guise of the Soviets are mobilizing at our borders, they forced our hand. The Soviet leadership made every effort to display zero military movement until the very last moment. Molotov argues that intelligence agents must always be kept in check, as provocateurs can easily drag a state into irreversible and dangerous positions. Nevertheless, Molotov still offers a self-criticism, confessing that their primary mistake lay in the timing. He notes they should have remembered that even Napoleon attacked Russia in June, and that the summer months are always the most dangerous period. However, because June 1940 passed without war, he admits they fell into the illusion that June 1941 might pass in the same manner. At the same time, Molotov emphasizes that the army and the populace had been under superhuman pressure for years due to war preparations, to the point that even the 7-hour workday limit had long been abolished. He explains that it was psychologically impossible to keep people, officers, and even Politburo members on a constant war is about to break out alert year after year. Everyone needed a breather. He attributes the fact that Western Front Commander Pavlov was at the theater, or that Zhdanov was on vacation in Sochi when the war started, to this extreme exhaustion and the inevitable need for a brief respite. The famous TASS news agency communique published shortly before the war, which stated that relations with Germany were normal, is described by Molotov not as an act of naivety, but as a deliberate diplomatic maneuver. The objective was to give Germany no excuse for provocation until the final second, and, if possible, stall the attack until autumn. Even though this maneuver did not yield the desired result, Molotov maintains it was a move that had to be made. He asserts that thanks to this communique, Hitler was cast as the definitive, undeniable aggressor in the eyes of the entire world, allowing the Soviet Union to gain allies. As for what happened on the night the war broke out, Molotov debunks the dramatized stories told by Western and certain Soviet sources. He states that accounts like Marshal Zhukov writing in his memoirs, "Stalin was asleep, I woke him up," were merely Zhukov's attempts to make himself look good. He recounts that by around 2 o'clock that morning, all Politburo members had already gathered in Stalin's office, waiting in a state of high alert. He explains that between 2:30 and 3:00 a.m., the German ambassador, Count von der Schulenburg, brought him the note containing the declaration of war. Molotov fiercely criticizes Western authors, stating he never uttered the line, "What did we do to deserve this?" to the ambassador as claimed in the Western press. He remarks that he would never say such a thing, and that it is a completely fabricated, ridiculous story. The allegations that Stalin was paralyzed with fear, lost his mind, or lost his ability to speak during the opening days of the war are also resolutely denied by Molotov. While he admits Stalin was deeply shaken, summarizing the situation at the time by saying, "We messed up," he emphasizes that Stalin continued to work day and night just as he always did. Furthermore, he does not attribute the fact that it was he, and not Stalin, who delivered the radio address announcing the war to the public on June 22 to Stalin being afraid. The relationship established by Soviet diplomacy with the Western Allies during the Second World War was not built on mutual trust. Rather, it relied entirely on pragmatic and tactical maneuvers. Molotov actually views the alliance formed with Britain and the United States between 1941 and 1945 as a fruit of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This was because the pact had divided the imperialists among themselves and prevented the formation of a united front against the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet leadership firmly believed that the true intention of the Western democracies was to leave the Soviet Union isolated against Germany and watch it bleed out to the very last drop. Amidst this climate of deep mistrust, One of the most striking moves of Soviet diplomacy was the historic pressure exerted on the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe in 1942. Molotov undertook this mission by Stalin's direct order during those days when the situation at the front line was at its most critical, setting off in absolute secrecy. Flying through enemy-occupied territories and across the ocean in a four-engine bomber, he made a perilous journey first to London and then to Washington. In these meetings, Molotov demanded that the Western Allies open a second front in Europe before the end of 1942 to draw 30 to 40 German divisions away from the Russian front. However, Molotov's confession years later lays bare the ruthless tactic of Soviet diplomacy. Neither Stalin nor he ever believed that the Allies could actually open such a front in 1942 or even 1943. Both were fully aware that under the conditions of the time, this was a completely impossible operation for the West. Despite this, they forced the Allies to sign a written document pledging to open a front in 1942, and American President Roosevelt accepted this communique text without making a single change. According to Molotov, two fundamental political strategies lay behind this impossible demand. First, it aimed to instill morale and hope in the Soviet people, who were living through their darkest days and reaching the brink of exhaustion, by showing them that the Allies would come to their aid. Second, it was a far more cunning diplomatic trap designed to corner the Western powers. When it inevitably became clear that Britain and the US could not keep this promise in 1942, they would be exposed as promise breakers in the eyes of their own publics. This loss of prestige for Churchill and Roosevelt would effectively leave the Western leaders as hostages in the hands of the Soviets. Indeed, the West's failure to deliver on its promises, and the embarrassing position they found themselves in before their peoples forced them to supply the Soviet Union with far more weapons, aircraft, and ammunition than before. Roosevelt actually calculated that the Soviets would emerge from the war so exhausted, starved, and impoverished that they would ultimately be dependent on American dollars and come begging to them. Molotov believed that underlying the American president's agreement to aid the Soviets was a calculation that the Russians would fight a little longer, stall the Germans, and let both sides exhaust each other. Churchill, on the other hand, was in Molotov's eyes the most intelligent and powerful imperialist among the capitalist leaders. Churchill keenly sensed that if the Soviet Union crushed Germany, the British Empire would be shaken to its foundations. During the war, instead of directly aiding the Soviets at the main front, the Western powers looked for ways to secure their own interests. For instance, instead of deploying British troops to the Western Front, Churchill offered to station them on Soviet soil under the pretext of defending Murmansk and the Caucasian oil fields. Stalin and Molotov instantly saw through this cunning move and rejected it, stating that they would protect Murmansk themselves, and demanded that the Allied forces be deployed directly to the actual front line. Similarly, Roosevelt wanted to establish American air bases in the Soviet Far East to use against Japan, but Molotov immediately opposed this, viewing it as a sinister part of an intention to occupy Soviet territory. Despite all these clashes and ideological hostilities, it was also a reality that Churchill harbored a great admiration for Stalin. According to Molotov, during intimate dinners at the Yalta and Tehran conferences, Churchill, with tears rolling down his cheeks, said that only Stalin could save the peace. Churchill even confessed that upon waking up in the morning, he sincerely prayed for Stalin to be alive and healthy. Molotov summarizes the nature of this alliance by recalling that while Britain lost just over 200,000 lives in the war, the Soviet Union suffered more than 20 million casualties. To him, Churchill hated the Soviets but was desperately dependent on them, and the Soviets likewise used him for their own purposes. This diplomatic chess match also manifested itself during the border negotiations. During the 1942 talks in London, Molotov resisted for a long time, demanding a border document that confirmed the Baltic states belonged to the Soviet Union. When Churchill firmly opposed this, Stalin sent a telegram to Molotov ordering him to drop this demand for the time being, and this unexpected flexibility left Churchill and his deputy Eden completely astonished. Although the issue was left open at that moment, Molotov states with great pride years later that the West was eventually forced to recognize these borders. In Molotov's eyes, this alliance with the Allies was not a story of friendship, but a relentless struggle where each party tried to use the other for their own ideological gains. In the end, Stalin achieved a colossal success in diplomacy by forcing the capitalist leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, to fight against Hitler in alignment with Soviet goals. With the end of the Second World War, Soviet diplomacy was entering a relentless Cold War chess match against the nuclear blackmail of the new President Truman and the economic traps of the West. Following the war, one of the greatest challenges for Soviet diplomacy was managing the relationship with Harry Truman, who assumed the U.S. presidency after Roosevelt's death. In Molotov's eyes, Truman was a typical imperialist with an overtly anti-Soviet mindset, far removed from Roosevelt's intellect. During their very first meeting, Truman spoke in a highly authoritarian and arrogant tone to assert his power and make it clear who the boss was. However, Molotov immediately shut him down by saying, "I cannot conduct talks with you if you speak to me in that tone," forcing him to adopt a more respectful manner. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, Truman aimed to shock Stalin and Molotov by casually mentioning that they now possessed an extraordinary new weapon of unprecedented power. The weapon Truman was referring to was, of course, the atomic bomb. Yet Stalin and Molotov received this news with such calm and lack of reaction that Truman believed they hadn't even grasped the significance of what this weapon meant. In reality, although the Soviet leaders instantly understood the gravity of the matter, they knew that America possessed only one or two bombs at that moment, which could not immediately be turned into an all-out war. More importantly, the Soviet Union had already launched its own atomic bomb project as early as 1943, under Molotov's direct responsibility. For this task, Molotov had evaluated famous names like Kapitsa and Ioffe, but ultimately selected the youngest and least-known scientist, Igor Kurchatov. To accelerate Kurchatov's work, Soviet intelligence provided a colossal boost to the project by passing him highly classified atomic bomb documents stolen from America. After reviewing these documents, Kurchatov stated that the materials were magnificent and filled the exact gaps they had been struggling with. Furthermore, Molotov implicitly acknowledged that the Rosenberg couple, who were executed in America due to this leak, had likely aided Soviet intelligence. Thanks to all these efforts, the West's nuclear monopoly and blackmail would soon be broken. In the shadow of this nuclear rivalry, Molotov pulled off a brilliant diplomatic bluff during his historic speech at the United Nations in 1946. In his address, he challenged the American monopoly by stating that if one country could manufacture an atomic bomb, another country could certainly build it too. He then announced to the world that the Soviet Union would soon possess not only the atomic bomb but also other things. In truth, this phrase, "other things," which was entirely Molotov's own invention, referred to long-range missiles and rockets. At that time, the Soviets possessed neither the atomic bomb nor operational missiles, but this move was designed to boost the morale of the Soviet public in the face of American nuclear blackmail. After the speech, Stalin congratulated Molotov, noting that this bold stance prevented the Soviets from appearing weak. Another critical diplomatic and economic turning point of the post-war era was the American-backed Marshall Plan. While Western historians view the Soviet rejection of this plan as a massive blunder, Molotov maintains it was absolutely the correct move. Initially, Molotov had agreed to participate in the plan and had even drafted a proposal for the Czechs and Poles to attend the conference in Paris, but he abruptly changed his mind within the same day. This was because he realized the true intention of the imperialists was to render communist countries dependent on them. Upon this realization, he immediately sent out a new directive strictly forbidding Czechoslovakia and Poland from joining the plan. According to Molotov, the Marshall Plan was nothing more than a cleverly designed imperialist trap to subvert socialist countries and reduce them to a second-class status. Similarly, severe disputes broke out with the West regarding the repayment of wartime American Lend-Lease aid. Molotov criticizes the West's attitude, noting that the Soviets never refused to pay the debt, but the Americans chose to crush the returned Studebaker trucks in massive hydraulic presses and dump them into the sea. Following all these tensions, the Western world coined the term Cold War for the process initiated by Winston Churchill's famous Fulton speech. However, Molotov states that he disliked this term, arguing that what was happening was simply the Soviet Union's struggle to retain the territories it had rightfully won in the war. Drawing from Stalin's famous remark that Russians win wars but do not know how to make peace, Molotov believed that as foreign minister, his ultimate duty was to prevent the fruits of victory from being stolen at the negotiating table. For this reason, they maintained a completely uncompromising stance against the West regarding war reparations from Germany and the determination of borders for countries like Poland. With the conclusion of the Second World War, the immense self-confidence brought by victory led to some dangerous delusions within the Soviet leadership, particularly in Stalin. Molotov openly confesses that in his final years, Stalin succumbed somewhat to his own pride, pushing boundaries by making excessive demands in foreign policy. One of the greatest diplomatic errors of this period was directly laying claim to Turkey and the Straits. Following the war, Stalin instructed Molotov to demand joint control over the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, echoing the dreams of old Tsarist-era politicians and Russian generals. Knowing that this request would be flatly rejected by the Allies, Molotov warned Stalin, objecting with the words, "They will not allow it." Yet Stalin refused to back down, forcing his foreign minister into this impossible task by saying, "Demand it anyway." Soviet diplomacy attempted to present this demand for control over the straits to the West as a matter of honor, and a right earned through their monumental victory in World War II. Years later, Molotov admitted that since Turkey was not a socialist state, the idea of pulling guard duty together with them in the straits was a completely misplaced and impossible fantasy. He notes that when Soviet ships moved toward the straits, the British were already there waiting, making this move a major blunder that cost them the support of the Allies. The Soviets' territorial demands were not limited to the straits either. Provoked by Georgian academics, claims were laid on certain Turkish territories along the Batumi border on behalf of the Georgians, under the pretext that the area had historically been populated by Georgians. During the same period, plans were made to give the area surrounding Mount Ararat to the Armenians, while in the south, Azerbaijan took action to nearly double its borders at the expense of Iranian territory. Molotov emphasizes that these excessive demands, driven by an eagerness to reassemble the territories of the old Tsarist Empire, were a massive diplomatic mistake. He notes that these audacious demands created immense fear in the Western world and united the Allies against them. "If we hadn't backed down, everyone would have pounced on us and launched a joint attack against us," he remarks, summarizing the severity of the situation and how prudent it was to abandon those claims in time. One of the most bizarre examples of this diplomatic overreach and misplaced self-confidence took place regarding North African geography. By Stalin's order, Molotov claimed at a foreign ministers' conference that a national liberation movement had begun in Libya, and demanded that this region be placed under direct Soviet control. Faced with this unexpected demand, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin became so enraged that he grew ill and had to be given an injection, reacting by shouting, "This is a shock, you've never even been there." Molotov does not hide his own helplessness when recounting how difficult it was to ground such demands on any logical basis in those days. Ultimately, these disproportionate steps taken along the Turkey, Iran, and North Africa axis in post-war diplomacy went down in history as arrogant tactical blunders that hardened the Cold War blocs rather than reinforcing Soviet security. Following Stalin's death in March 1953, the massive power vacuum created in the Soviet Union was initially filled by a fragile alliance that Molotov referred to as the Triumvirate, consisting of Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev. From the very beginning, Molotov viewed this alliance with deep suspicion, believing that no genuine friendship or ideological bond existed among them, and that only temporary interests held them together. This lack of unity within the leadership soon manifested itself in profound clashes over core state policies. The most critical of these conflicts erupted over the future of East Germany and Germany as a whole. Beria advocated for a complete overhaul of the Soviet policy toward Germany, arguing that whether East Germany remained socialist was of no importance, and that the only thing that truly mattered was creating a peaceful Germany. Molotov fiercely opposed this view, arguing that it would mean capitulating to imperialism and that the achievements of socialism could not be abandoned. During these intense debates within the Politburo, Khrushchev, who, unlike Beria, possessed a vein of Russian patriotism, unexpectedly sided with Molotov. This ideologically driven rift effectively marked the beginning of the process that led to Beria's downfall. Operating as a highly effective organizer, Khrushchev orchestrated a secret plan to oust Beria, securing the backing of Molotov and other members prior to a crucial Politburo meeting. At this historic session, presided over by Malenkov, Molotov was the first to openly speak out, branding Beria as a corrupt figure alienated from the party. Following the discussions, upon a prearranged signal from Malenkov, military officers led by Marshal Zhukov, who had been waiting in the adjacent room, burst into the chamber and arrested Beria, bringing a definitive end to his dangerous influence. With Beria removed from the picture, Khrushchev began consolidating his power, and the deep ideological chasms between him and Molotov became increasingly evident. Molotov profoundly looked down on Khrushchev's lack of theoretical knowledge, comparing him to a shrewd small-time livestock trader rather than a Marxist thinker. In Molotov's eyes, Khrushchev represented a petty bourgeois, right deviationist, and Bukharinist mindset that craved a quiet life and consumer comfort instead of the demanding, revolutionary tasks of building socialism. This clash of mindsets reached its most bitter peak when Khrushchev's famous Virgin Lands campaign was brought to the table. Despite a massive deficit in infrastructure, machinery, and manpower, Khrushchev sought to open 40 to 45 million hectares of virgin land to agriculture, a move Molotov dismissed as pure adventurism, arguing instead that investments should be directed toward already settled regions. However blindly devoted to his project, Khrushchev branded Molotov an enemy of progress and pushed forward like an unbridled horse. This ideological war between the two men soon spilled over into foreign policy and the fundamental interpretations of Leninism. Khrushchev's elevation of peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world to official state policy was viewed by Molotov as a dangerous pacifist delusion and a massive concession to imperialism. To Molotov, peace was not something to be begged for from imperialists. It was a goal that could only be achieved through their ultimate overthrow. This simmering tension culminated at the historic 20th Party Congress in 1956, during Khrushchev's infamous secret speech denouncing Stalin. While many wondered why Molotov remained silent in the face of this heavy assault, he explained years later that this was a tactical silence, knowing that open opposition at that moment would have led to his immediate expulsion and a catastrophic split within the party. Furthermore, Molotov believed that behind Khrushchev's assault on Stalin lay a deep personal vendetta rather than political principles, specifically a desire to avenge his eldest son, who had been executed for treason during the war. Following this turning point, convinced that the current trajectory was driving the Soviet state into an abyss, Molotov joined forces with Malenkov and Kaganovich in the summer of 1957 to overthrow Khrushchev. Securing the support of 7 out of 11 members in a Politburo vote, they successfully managed to remove Khrushchev from his position as first secretary. However, proving to be a master tactician, Khrushchev, with the aid of loyalists like Suslov and Serov, urgently flew Central Committee members from all corners of the country to Moscow to convene a plenum. This plenum overrode the Politburo's decision and executed a political countercoup, declaring Molotov and his associates the anti-party group. Following this heavy defeat, Molotov was swiftly marginalized. He was first sent as ambassador to Mongolia, then exiled to Vienna, and ultimately stripped of all state duties and expelled from the Communist Party in 1962. Despite his expulsion and the systematic efforts to erase his name from all official records, Molotov never compromised on his convictions. Even while living on a modest state pension, he wrote letters to the Central Committee after every party congress, demanding the reinstatement of his membership, yet he never renounced his belief in the necessity of the harsh policies of the 1930s. He viewed the Khrushchev and subsequent Brezhnev eras as years of ideological decay and dangerous complacency. In the twilight of his life, Molotov's stubborn resistance unexpectedly bore fruit. In 1984, at the age of 94, he was summoned to the Kremlin by Konstantin Chernenko, where his party card, confirming the reinstatement of his membership that dated back to 1906, was quietly handed back to him. Unrepentant until his final breath, Molotov continued to believe that despite all the ruthless excesses, the iron-fisted leadership of their era was the only force capable of saving the Soviet state from annihilation. We are wrapping up the first part here. Don't forget to follow us for the next part.